Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Nino Gugushvili will defend the academic thesis, Digital Communication Technologies and Mental Health, an interplay between usage types and user characteristics. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusion of your thesis.
Thank you, dear Prorector, dear members of the Corona, dear family, friends, and colleagues. In the upcoming 15 minutes, I will summarize the findings from my dissertation. As we all know, smartphones and social networking sites are ubiquitous in our society. As of 2023, billions of people use these technologies on a daily basis. Therefore, it's important to understand how these technologies might affect our mental health. And let me very briefly overview what we know so far. On the one hand, we know that there is serious public concern and negative attitude towards these technologies. As such, smartphones and social networking sites are blamed for destroying a generation and for causing a mental health crisis. On the other hand, we also know that the actual empirical evidence is quite mixed. As such, the field has just recently concluded that most likely the amount of time that we spend on these technologies decreases our mental health. However, the effect is so small that it has almost no practical value at all. However, there's one big issue with this conclusion. Specifically, the amount of time that we spend on these technologies, also known as screen time, hides deeper complexities. And let me explain what I mean. First of all, we can use both smartphones and social networking sites in different ways. For instance, for connecting with friends and family, but also for, stalking and monitoring other people's lives. And these different activities will lead to different mental health outcomes. However, screen time measures cannot really capture these differences. Second, we as users differ. We differ in terms of our age, gender, and personality traits, to name a few. Therefore, we need to take these individual differences into account when we talk about the impact of these technologies. And finally, imagine the following scenario. For instance, person A spends 5 hours a day on their smartphone and social networking sites, however, uses these technologies mostly for productivity and connection. Importantly, has no problem to put down their phone when not needed. On the other hand, person B, who also uses these technologies for 5 hours a day, neglects other important daily activities and basically gets really upset when he's forced to stop using these technologies. Now, the first is an example of healthy usage, whereas the second is an example of problematic use. However, and again, screen time measures cannot really capture these differences. And in this thesis, basically, we tried to address these shortcomings. In the first study, we decided to extend or refine our understanding of how people use social networking sites, and for this purpose, we refined the original active-passive model of social networking sites use. And let me very briefly explain what this model posits. Basically, according to the original model, people can use social networking sites in active way, that is for connection and interaction, and this will lead to increases in mental health. However, they can also use social networking sites passively, that is for monitoring other people's lives, and this will lead to decreases in mental health. And we argued that, basically we proposed 3 extensions, and we argued that, first of all, when we talk about active use, interaction type matters. Second, in the case of passive use, content type matters. And finally, we should ask for whom is either active or passive use good or bad. And in this thesis, we specifically focused on this third question. Basically, to answer this question, this third question, we conducted a systematic review to understand which individual differences have been studied so far. And we found 2 interesting patterns. First is that the evidence is quite limited and also scattered in that there is no underlying, most often than not, there is no underlying reasoning, strong theoretical reasoning or logic why specific individual differences are selected. And second, we also found that for people who tend to compare themselves with others, passive use of social networking sites leads to decreases in mental health. In the third study, we further studied individual differences, however, this time in the context of both smartphone use, but also Instagram use. And because we saw in the previous study that individual differences were quite understudied, we focused on two specific personality traits, neuroticism and extroversion. Very briefly, neurotics are often described as moody, sensitive, and worried, whereas extroverts are often described as sociable, outgoing, energetic, and enthusiastic. Now, what we found is that for neurotic users, when they spend more time on smartphones than their typical average, also when they use Instagram more passively than their average, they tend to experience more negative emotions. And in the case of extroverts, only the amount of time spent on smartphones predicts decreases in positive emotion. Now, in the next three studies, we basically shifted our focus from relatively healthy usage patterns to more problematic usage patterns. However, we tried also to keep the individual differences in mind. So basically, we knew from the past literature that intense use of Facebook most likely leads to depressive symptoms, but we wanted to explain why this is the case. And we expected that problematic Facebook use would explain this relationship. And indeed, we found that this was the case. But we also asked whether these relationships are similar for extroverted users, neurotic users, and younger versus older users. And what we found is that these relationships are extremely harmful or bad for neurotic users and younger users, whereas these relationships are not really significant for extroverted users. In the fifth study, which was a survey study basically, because we identified neuroticism as a key vulnerability factor for problematic social networking sites use, we again decided to explain why this is the case, that neurotics are or tend to engage in problematic use of social networking sites more. And here basically we expected that two psychological mechanisms, fear of missing out and self-control, would explain this relationship. And very briefly, fear of missing out is basically anxiety that person is missing out on rewarding social experiences. And what we found, interestingly, we tested these two mechanisms together. And what we found is that FOMO indeed explains why neurotic users engage more in problematic use, whereas self-control does not explain this relationship. And in the sixth study, which again was a survey study, because we saw from the previous study that FOMO is also an important predictor for problematic usage patterns, we tested whether those who experience higher levels of FOMO also tend to engage in more problematic smartphone use, and whether this would then predict decreases in emotional well-being. And again, we found that this was the case. And interestingly, we also found that in the case of problematic smartphone use, two aspects are especially harmful. First, when a person prefers online friendships over offline friendships, this is actually very harmful for their emotional well-being. And second, when they overuse their smartphones so much that they actually develop physical symptoms, such as, for instance, insomnia or blurred vision or, let's say, neck pain. This is also quite harmful. Now, to summarize, these findings have some implications. Basically, across these studies, we have shown that in order to understand how these technologies impact our mental health, we should consider both who users are, but also how they use these technologies. And based on this, we encourage researchers to retire these broad screen time measures and consider measuring more nuanced usage patterns, but also we encourage them to consider individual differences and uncover specific psychological mechanisms that might lead to specific mental health outcomes. Then, based on our findings, we also have few recommendations for the policymakers. First of all, I think we should avoid kind of one-size-fits-all type policies, and we should, or policymakers should, educate and inform specific subgroups of users regarding the harms associated with usage of smartphones and social networking sites, for instance, neurotic users, but also younger users, but also those who tend to engage in social comparisons. Then our findings, I think, also have some relevance for the practitioners. And we have shown that there are specific subgroups, right, who are most likely to experience detriments when they use these technologies. Therefore, and some of them are unfortunately not really amendable, such as neuroticism or age. We cannot do much. But we also identified fear of missing out, which is more targetable. So I think this might be interesting for the practitioners to use. And we already know also that there are some strategies to reduce FOMO, so they could make use of these interventions. And finally, we also highly encourage more responsible news coverage of these topics, because we often see these dystopian and quite sensationalist headlines blaming social networking sites and smartphones for destroying our mental health. However, at least at this point, we don't have enough empirical evidence to really back up such bold claims. Thank you very much. I give the word back to you.
Thank you for your presentation. The position will be opened by Professor Kai Jonas, Professor of Applied Social Psychology at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, first of all, congratulations for your really beautiful thesis. I enjoyed reading it. I had FOMO of not being able to get to the end. And I was also very happy to hear that I'm not in danger of bad mental health outcomes because I'm not using Facebook. So I'm not in danger. But I have some questions that I would like to invite you to think along into the future. When I looked at your model, you always put mental health well-being as an outcome measure. And then you explore moderators and mediators, and as close as it comes to what an individual brings into the media use are traits like Big Five and neuroticism and extroversion. But don't you think that it would be necessary to extend your model to basically take a mental health diagnosis into the model itself? So what happens to a user who is already depressed? What happens to a user who suffers from body dysmorphic perception disorder and then gets exposed to beautiful bodies and so forth? So that would be my first question. And my second question relates to the active-passive model. And you've used social network sites like Instagram and Facebook, where I can see the fit of the active-passive model. But here comes my question: how does the active-passive model pan out in the context of dating sites or dating apps? And how would you apply the model to these kind of social media applications? Thank you.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and questions. First of all, I agree that the models that we presented and that we tested actually all those cases, mental health was an outcome variable. However, we also know from the literature that these causal arrows can go both ways, and I think that this is indeed very interesting topic, especially if we study these relationships in clinical settings, so to speak. And honestly, the main focus of this dissertation was more or less like, I don't know how to say, healthy population, so to speak. However, I think that this is something very interesting for the future studies to consider actually people who have some mental health diagnosis, for instance, but also there are very interesting cases also, for instance, for autistic people, how they use this kind of technologies, or people who have psychosis or clinical depression. So indeed, this is something that is very interesting, and maybe hopefully I will be able to work on these topics. And with regards to the second question, which was about dating sites, right? I think that to be honest, the definition of social networking sites is already quite contested. So as the way we use this definition, actually dating sites are not really included in this case. However, if I were to, and honestly I have not actually tried ever to explain specific behaviors on dating sites. However, if I were to explain, then I think more or less it's like balanced, both active and passive use takes place in this dating apps, because people are like also swiping left and right? So this probably we could also consider some sort of active use. So I think that in that sense, the model and its assumptions would change a little bit, and probably it will not be as straightforward as we have now, because we now have specific underlying mechanisms, right? For instance, we argued that there is social capital on the one hand, and then there is social comparison orientation on the other hand. However, in the context of dating, this will be a bit like I really don't think that social capital would be that relevant, to be honest, to a certain degree. So yeah, I don't know, there is some value, I think, to extend this model to the dating sites as well, but I don't immediately see how.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers, and I give the word back to the pro-rector.
The position will be continued by Professor Eggermont, Professor of Mass Communication at KU Leuven.
Thank you. Dear candidate, it was a pleasure to read your dissertation. I easily made it to the final sentence of your dissertation. And I'm mentioning that because I wanted to ask a question about the final sentence of your dissertation. This is that sentence. Overall, this dissertation demonstrates that the impact of digital communication technologies on mental health is complex and depends on an interaction between usage type and user characteristics. As you know, that's your final sentence. I couldn't agree more. And I want to add that this conclusion could only be reached after the work that you've done. Your dissertation reports on excellent research, I must say, that is not merely aimed at describing phenomena, but also trying to understand them. So it's essentially a dissertation that has all and everything one could hope for as a member of a committee. So congratulations, excellent work. But as I said, I do have a question about your conclusion, about the final sentence. My question is about the caution underlying that sentence and that conclusion. A less academic, less scholarly way of putting your final thought could be, it depends. Sometimes there is an impact, sometimes there isn't. It depends, which is a cautious conclusion. One interpretation of your cautious conclusion is that such conclusion is what we can expect from an academic. A scholar understands that it's never black or white, it's always nuanced. Another interpretation of your conclusion, your cautious conclusion, is that you and we as behavioral and social scientists are not convinced that there is always doubt in our mind, leading to caution to mild and balanced views. But when young people spend more time with social media than they spend in schools, society may be expecting a less balanced answer. Just as society at a certain point in time heard from science that smoking, that tobacco is bad for one's health. My question is, do you think we will ever be able to give a clear-cut answer to the question whether social media affect mental health? Or, and that's also an important addition to my question, is that not the ambition of our research to give clear-cut answers society can work with?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments and for the questions. First of all, I completely agree that I think people are quite disappointed when we say depends, especially if it concerns children's mental health or other sensitive topics, and certainly this is a very academic answer, I agree. However, with regards to the clear answer, I think the main issue, in terms of ambition, I think a lot of researchers are really trying their best to answer this question as unambiguously as possible, but the main problem is that basically we are using rudimentary tools at this point to reconstruct something that takes place somewhere else, and we don't have access to the high quality data. That's why I think, and that's why one of the implications was to push these big tech companies to collaborate with us, because really the best measures that we have so far are quite not that great, let's put it this way. So I think that unless we don't get this high quality data, we will always be in this kind of strange situation where we are trying to find the patterns. We see some kind of patterns, but we are really not sure what is going on. And I think that this is also quite visible in terms of, for instance, when we look at the longitudinal studies. I think we don't even know the time window when these effects take place, right? Because we have this panel data when we have one time point 6 months ago or so, and then the other afterwards, or sometimes we have these diary studies that are very intensive, but we as a field don't really know also the effects that take place and when they take place. So that's why I think that either we need to, I don't know, establish our own companies as researchers, or really collaborate with the tech companies and push them to share their data. Thank you.
Thank you. May I perhaps add, to what extent do you think we are really not sure? If someone walks in, a Minister of Youth, for instance, would that be your answer? We are not sure yet until we have the data companies might provide?
Thank you. No, I would say that we have some certainty. For instance, that specific patterns of usage are more harmful than others. We could say that. We could also say that, for instance, we have this nice criteria, right, for problematic usage. So we could test and check, so to speak, and we could tell a person whether their usage is bad or not, so to speak. However, I'm more referring to this, how to say, dystopian views that we quite often see recently in the news headlines, and I personally think that these are quite misleading, because we also see that there's a push from certain researchers to say that social networking sites, for instance, destroy or have already destroyed our mental health, and we that regard, I really don't think that we can say that, and we can really speak about causality in those terms. Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Christian Montag, Professor of Molecular Psychology at Ulm University.
Thank you so much also from my side. I enjoyed reading your thesis a lot, dear candidate, and I appreciate the insights and the nuanced views you provide us on this really highly relevant topic, which is fiercely discussed in societies around the world. Shoshana Zuboff describes our societies as being pushed by companies via surveillance capitalism. This is her view on matters. And clearly, platforms have been designed to prolong our online times. But if we take a look at all the social media platforms, they're designed, well, in parts differently. We don't find all the design elements everywhere. The successful ones usually hop and are copied, but clearly different design elements perhaps also create a different online environment, luring in different user groups. And I wonder a bit if you could reflect on your theory, your extended theory on active-passive use of social media, concerning the point if you think it can be transferred to all the social media platforms we have there, because they're different in terms of their addictive potential and so forth. So in clear words, do we see some platforms which are perhaps, due to the platform design, more eliciting passive use, for instance, than other platforms?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments and for the questions. First of all, I agree that we indeed live in the surveillance capitalism, and indeed I also agree, I know that I write in the thesis that these tools are not either good or bad, but I also think that, or I tend to differentiate between the tools and the owners in this case, and I agree that these owners, for instance, Meta or other owners, so to speak, don't necessarily think about our welfare as such, and they are oriented on profits. So I think that with regards to the active-passive, extended active-passive model, I think we could definitely discuss this model within this framework, and probably we cannot really extend this model to all platforms similarly, because, for instance, we have these extremely commercial platforms such as Facebook, which is like seeing something do. For instance, TikTok does something and they copy that immediately, but we also have other healthier platforms, right? For instance, Mastodon. And I really don't think that we can easily compare these platforms, and this is another very interesting topic for future research, to examine how these platforms really differ and to what extent they are similar to be generalized. But I think that this particular model tries to capture these most popular social networking sites, I think, from TikTok to Instagram to Facebook and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you for your elaborated question. I have another second very short question, and it tackles about another very fiercely debated topic, namely, is what we see here really problematic social media behavior? Is it addictive or not? I mean, you proposed or decided to speak of problematic social media use, and I mean, problematic social media use could be also cyberbullying, and obviously you chose from the inventories in your work an addictive framework. So perhaps you can reflect a bit upon the discussions at the moment. Do we need a distinct diagnosis, social media addiction, as we have seen with gaming disorder in the current ICD-11? Where do we stand in the field? And perhaps you can give us also your view on the terms we should use in the literature. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, in this thesis, we deliberately avoided the term addiction. And I think, yeah, we explained this several times as well in those chapters. The reason is that there's this danger to over-pathologize everyday behaviors. And with regards to the official diagnosis, I think so far what we have and what we know, basically, in order to count someone as addictive, I think we have these components, right? Specific components according to which we say that, okay, this is problematic or not. And when we talk about the problematic usage, I think we don't really, like a person doesn't have to check all the 6 boxes. However, if we are talking about the addiction, then we have to have all the 6 components checked, so to speak. And based on my reading, at least, I think that there is some anecdotal evidence when people are really addicted to these technologies. But if we look and read this literature, when sometimes people use addiction term, they still are measuring more like a problematic use. So again, I think that at this point we really don't have that much evidence to talk about addiction as such. However, I also don't, I would say, deny that it could be possible once we have enough evidence. But we should definitely try to avoid pathologizing kind of normal behavior, because sometimes we do things excessively. We all do, like sometimes we eat excessively, but we are not we are not addicted to food, right? It's the same with the social networking sites, I think, in most cases. Thank you.
The position will be continued by Professor Yuri Alik, who is joining us online.
First of all, my congratulations on excellent dissertation. I can assure that you made all us in Tartu very happy, and of course I really appreciate and thank you for being such a good bridge between our 2 universities, Maastricht and Tartu. But my question is about perhaps slightly away from the main topic of your dissertation. I noticed and I wonder if you have any evidence that the current generation of young people addicted to all these smart gadgets, have they something specific, very different from the grandmothers or mothers or parents being afraid? I understand that probably one generation may be afraid being alone, but in your study, for me it was surprising that the being afraid to lose the control wasn't very important variable. And my question is, have you noticed any let's say time specific or indicators of things which current generation of people are afraid, particularly afraid?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments and for the questions. If I understood your question correctly, you are asking about the current generation, like the youngest generation that we have, and whether they use these technologies a bit differently. Am I right?
Yes. This and other question, are there any age or nowadays specific symptoms of neuroticism or let's say negative feelings, because people can be very different, afraid of very many different things, but what is specific and what is most dominant fear among nowadays population?
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I think that, first of all, given that Gen Z is the first digital native, so to speak, I think they have very specific usage patterns, a bit different even from millennials, and most likely they are bit differently impacted by using these technologies. However, I think that with regards to the neuroticism and age, basically from the broader literature, we know that neuroticism is especially strong when people are young. So I think that one of the underlying reasons what they are nervous about is that they are kind of connected with their peers and they don't want to really miss out on socially important events or experiences. But yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Ken Constabel, Associate Professor of Personality and Social Psychology at the University of Tartu.
Thank you, and dear candidate, thank you as well for your unusually thorough dissertation, I would say. It was not an easy reading, but a good reading, definitely. I have a number of questions, but maybe there might be time for two small ones. I was thinking about the downward social comparison. So the way you describe it in the thesis might make one think that this happens automatically. That if I see someone is doing better than myself, then I feel bad. So is it possible to accept that someone is doing better and much better? And maybe you could speculate on the personal characteristics that might make one possible to accept this, or maybe some techniques. And the other small question concerns time budget. So if you're using social media, there are certain things you can do at the same time. For example, eat an apple perhaps, but you can't read a book. So there are some activities that you can't do. And if you use lots of time on social media, there will be certain activities that you will miss. So might that be another aspect of social media use that might be worth of some attention? Thank you.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your questions. I apologize. Can I ask you to repeat the first question?
Yes, it's about the downward social comparisons. So if you see on the social media, for example, someone being better than you, does it harm you automatically, or are there some ways to prevent these harmful effects? Or are there some people who maybe are more who are better at avoiding these potentially harmful effects?
Thank you for the clarification. If I understood your question correctly, you are asking whether social comparison processes are kind of uniform for all users, right? Well, I think that some people, like, we are talking about the state and trait differences, I think, because one assumption is that if we are exposed to specific kind of content, then this will most likely trigger upward social comparisons, but we also know that some people have this trait tendency, so to speak, to engage this kind of social comparisons. So for those, I think this is especially harmful, and probably even more neutral content could trigger these kinds of comparisons and envy. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just a small additional question here. Is there anything in your data regarding this question? Like, as I understand, the downward social comparison does not happen automatically and the same way for all. So can you see any variables that you have studied as a potential mediator of this effect?
I am so sorry, but could you please repeat the question? Because I cannot really hear well.
Oh, right. Sorry, maybe it's the microphone. So, as I understand, the downward social comparison doesn't happen automatically. People do something to bring this effect out. So, do you have any variables in your data that you might use as moderators of this effect?
Oh, sorry, for the downward social comparison, right? I think in our model, basically, this is a bit like an open-ended question for the downward social comparison, but I think that one of the, I cannot immediately think of the moderators, but I think in itself, the content type that we are exposed to could also trigger downward social comparisons. However, I also think that this does not happen very often, that people post these kinds of content on social networking sites, because usually we see this so-called positivity bias, whereas when people really try to portray the best lives or best photos, upload both best photos. So I think that most likely this does not happen often. That would be my guess. However, I also think that specific content can certainly trigger downward social comparisons. For instance, if you see someone failing in a domain that is very important for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, your position will be continued by Dr. Thomas Frissen, Digital Technology in Society at Maastricht University.
Okay, dear candidate, yeah, it's a pleasure to sit here today and to debate your very nice PhD dissertation here on social media and mental health with you today. And I want to join the others and congratulate you with this very well-written thesis that is supported by and deeply rooted in unambiguous empirical findings. It's novel, it's original, and it makes a significant contribution to the current field that is preoccupied with the social media mental health nexus. So, congratulations with that. Now you demonstrate, and I say this now consciously more explicitly than that you do that in your fine work here, but you demonstrate that the relationship between digital media and mental health can be highly combustible. Well, that is, if one possesses the right or wrong raw materials in combination with the right or wrong ignition source. And I think that is also the two ground propositions, or the two propositions that your thesis is grounded in, is that if we wish to understand the impacts of social media better, we need to A, factor in user characteristics, And B, we have to look at specific types of social media usage. That second proposition is something that I now would like to take some time to exchange some thoughts about with you. So this question is about your proposed model on page 24. We already talked about it. And your dissertation clearly makes a good point that aggregated effects are insufficient to explain how social media, including smartphones, affect mental health. You also rightly argue that types of usage need to be decomposed. And while previous studies have already decomposed social networking site usage in passive and active types, your dissertation goes further. You basically multiply the granularity with a factor 4. From 2 types, active and passive, you suggest 8 types, active, passive, and within active, warm and cold, and targeted and non-targeted, and within passive, success and failure, and self-relevance, high and versus low. And on page 147, you also say that your findings underscore the value of measuring these technologies in a fine-grained manner. Yet, on page 28, you argue that this is still not fine-grained enough, and that you expect future research to identify additional composition dimensions. Now, this provokes the following question in me, and that is, how fine-grained should we really go with such a measure of digital media usage? It reminded me a bit of this article in The Wired in 2008 by Chris Anderson entitled "The End of Theory." So he writes, "Out with every theory of human behavior from linguistics to sociology. Forget taxonomy, ontology, and psychology. Who knows why people do what they do? The point is that they do it, and we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity. With enough data, the numbers speak for themselves." So my question is, to what extent are you actually implicitly between the lines suggesting here that a data-driven or maybe data scientific approach would be required in order to better understand social media usage? Would you believe that if we have the data, also per your recommendations, from these platforms, that we would get to different insights? And if so, what different insights?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the compliments and questions. Well, I recently read the article that you are referring to, and I was really surprised, to be honest, because it seemed overly optimistic even for me. And I'm usually very optimistic with regards to technologies, and then I had to check the publication year, and I discovered that it was written 15 years ago, and it was like it became immediately clear why it was so optimistic, because nowadays we know that big data is indeed not the answer, and we know that more information, like more data, does not translate into more information. There is data redundancy problems, and I mean, it has its own issues. That being said, it can be used, and I found that, yeah, it was just the beginning of the big data, and that's why the author was probably so excited. I really don't think that we can throw away confirmatory research and completely abandon hypothesis testing. I think certainly we can and we should use exploratory data approaches, including big data, to generate this hypothesis. But I think that at some point we also need to test them, and we cannot really do that if we throw away all the confirmatory part and we just say that correlations are sufficient, so to speak. So in that sense, I think that the way I see at least is that, of course, now when we are proposing that we need this data, it's not that I immediately have, so to speak, a plan how to analyze this data, but I indeed include, like, I imagine that there will be some exploratory research, and we will be able to generate some interesting hypotheses. However, I certainly think, and I also think that this thesis, unlike numbers and data, speaks for itself in a way that it's very confirmatory and very theory-driven. So, and I also, like, in general, like even the biggest discoveries, like Higgs particle, for instance, I think it was a combination of both, exploratory and confirmatory, but ultimately it was basically confirmatory in that sense. So that is to say that I think if we want to explain something and if we want to understand, then we cannot really approach science this way, to throw away the confirmatory part, so to say. Thank you.
Okay, can I follow up? I'm not fully satisfied yet. So you thank you for your answer. Of course, it was and it's a very good point that you're making. But my question is, you now have 8 different types of social media use, and you say future studies should still be more fine-grained. So how fine-grained should we go?
Thank you. This is an interesting question. I think when we wrote that, I believe we meant more theory-driven approach instead of just adding lots of dimensions. So this was the, like, we certainly don't want to discourage people to use exploratory research, but we also certainly, at least the way I see is that people will basically come up with some theoretical assumptions as to why they should add some specific dimensions or not. And I think that I agree, like I share your concern that it's already too granular, but also the social media landscape is very complex, and I think that more simplistic explanation is not sufficient at this point anymore. I mean the original active-passive model, because we see that the empirical evidence does not really fully support this. So I think this was a necessary step to further refine our understanding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We can continue our opposition with the second round of questions. So I would like to give the room first to our external guests. Then we go first with Professor Eggermont from KU Leuven.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I usually ask methodological or theoretical questions when I'm in committees like this one. But I think we've come to a point where we need to discuss critical and practical implications. I think my first question was already in that realm, and I also would like to ask a second question that in a way it refers to the answer you gave to my first question. In the final chapter of your dissertation, you have a part, practical implications. And in that part of your dissertation, you ask a very polite question to the platform developers. Basically, the question reads, collaborate with researchers, share your data. Is that it? Is that all you would like to ask to platform developers? Couldn't be another question that is equally important? Please start taking your responsibility. Please protect our privacy. Are these kind of questions not that important to you, as I have now the impression?
Thank you for these questions. I think the reason why I wrote these particular recommendations and suggestions, it's not that I don't want them to be responsible or I don't find that important, but I try to approach it more realistically, so to speak. And I think that, at least the way I see it, there's certain trade-off what we can demand from them and what they are going to do in reality, because we know that, for instance, even regulations differ across countries, right? For instance, in Europe, users are relatively more protected compared to the United States and vice versa. So I think that if we want to achieve something, then maybe we should, this is the way I see a solution, that we can at least start with the data. I really wish we could demand more, but I'm afraid that this will not be feasible, because then probably they are also going to use their power and other things that they usually do to avoid this kind of regulations, and we should somehow find the right balance, so to speak. So this is the reason why I only focused on this data sharing aspect. Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Christian Montag, Professor of Molecular Psychology, Ulm University.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the chance to shoot another question. I go more in the methods direction now, and I'd like to touch upon the field of personality psychology a bit. In your thesis, you have worked clearly with neuroticism and extraversion as two relevant personality traits. The one question I have you considered to run facet analyses? It's highly on vogue in the field of personality psychology at the moment to take a closer look on facets of personality, and of course I think you chose the BFI in your work, which is composed of the facets anxiety and depression. I wonder, is the one facet more important for an understanding of your models than the other one? That's the one short question I have. And the second one is, if we take a look at meta-analyses on the Big Five and social media addiction or problematic social media use, whatever we want to call it here, is then extraversion is not so relevant. We know that conscientiousness is the second big personality trait of relevance. And I wonder if you have also some insights touching upon your research field with the active-passive use related to conscientiousness. Thank you.
Thank you. To begin with, indeed, facet analysis is very interesting in itself, but I think that unfortunately the measures we used in our studies were already quite limited. I think we used 8 items from neuroticism, so it was not really feasible. So unfortunately that was the case. And with regards to the second question about conscientiousness, and the extended active-passive use, if I understood correctly, you are asking about problematic usage patterns, right?
Yes.
And the thing is that this model is best served for healthy usage patterns, so to speak, and there certainly is possibility to extend this, but then we also risk losing parsimony. So in that sense, I think I don't immediately see its place in this model. However, I think that there are other theoretical frameworks that are very well suited for that. For instance, the I-PACE model, which basically is quite well suited to, and we can model other personality traits as well. Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Kai Jonas, Professor of Applied Social Psychology at Maastricht University.
Thank you. I have another question, because looking sort of at the ecological validity of the sites that you were sort of using and applying, and then there are more sites popping up. We're not only using Instagram or Facebook, but you may have a multitude of social network sites for professional reasons. And I was curious what your thoughts are on how these the use of different sites and the different types of use can actually interact, exacerbate, or buffer the outcomes that you're proposing. Now it's rather linear, like you go into one site, that's the outcome. But how does that work in a more ecologically valid context of using multiple sites?
Thank you. I think that certainly this is one of the limitations of these studies that I presented today, that we take one specific platform, or we take generic usage of these platforms, and we don't test them, so to speak, simultaneously. And there are some interesting findings already that show that, for instance, active use and passive use are quite different for different platforms. And certainly, I think some platforms, I already mentioned this if I remember correctly, that are more designed for passive use, for instance TikTok, whereas others encourage more active patterns. And I think that I don't immediately have an answer how they would interact with each other, but this is certainly something very interesting for the future studies, to try to really incorporate all this not all, but relevant social media platforms, and test also understand how people really use these multiple platforms.
Sorry, do you think that people are strategically coping, sort of that they're cognizant about now I've engaged in a type of use that wasn't leading to an outcome that I liked. Now I compensate, do something else on a different platform to make me happy again?
Well, honestly, I think that even if we use at least, like we did not really study this, so this is basically my personal opinion at this point, but I think that people usually have, even if we have lots of different accounts, we have strong preference in a way. So I think that, for instance, we know that younger people tend to go mostly to Instagram, but not to Facebook.
You may finish your sentence.
Thank you. So I think that basically what I was trying to say is that younger people, even though they have Instagram and Facebook accounts, at least what I know is that they just have Facebook account, but they don't really go to compensate anything, but they just have it because they need to have it at some point. But mostly they use Instagram and TikTok, so it's quite fragmented in that sense, and I think that's it. Thank you.
Nino Gugushvili, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. adventure that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
good. Nino Gugushvili, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. Verduin is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Okay, dear Nino, I have to ask you a very important question now. Okay. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
That's the correct answer. By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Nino Gugushvili, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Okay, dear Nino, actually I prepared notes, but just before entering, I realized I don't have them with me. But I thought I will speak from the heart. I should be able to do this after all these years that we work together, so let me give it a try. First of all, I would like to congratulate you, not only on my behalf, but also on behalf of Karin and Rob, so I am speaking for the three of us, okay? So, congratulations. You did it, you're officially a doctor. I think this is, of course, the end of a long journey. And I thought it would be nice to go back to the start. And maybe also the audience is curious how we together ended up here. And well, I don't know whether you still remember, but you first contacted me in October 2017. So that's already quite a while ago. And you told me that you were interested in doing research on the impact of social media on mental health. And you attached a nice research proposal to your email. And I read it. We had a chat on Zoom. And it was immediately clear to me that you are a very talented and ambitious student. But there was a problem. I did not have any funding, so I could not offer you a PhD position. But you don't give up easily. And half a year later, you reached out to me again and you said you had wonderful news because there was a possibility in Tartu, an open vacancy, an open competition, and you also met a social media expert working there at Tartu University. And then together with Karin, you applied there for the vacancy. And Karin told me that the admission committee was very, very impressed by your application and that they were very happy to accept you. So now you also know this. And that is also why today you actually get 2 degrees, 2 for the price of 1. So 1 from Tartu and 1 from Maastricht University. I think that throughout the past years, I got to know you a little bit better, and I would like to highlight a few traits that I think stood out to me and I think really characterize you. So first of all, I think you're a very flexible person. You worked from 3 different countries. You worked from Estonia, the Netherlands, and of course also from your home country, Georgia, because due to the lockdown measures, it was not possible to work on campus for a long time. I guess I can only imagine how difficult that must have been at times to constantly adjust, constantly relocate, but you are flexible, so you pulled it off, so that's very nice. A second thing I think which characterizes you is that you are some sort of a walking encyclopedia. Whenever I need a reference on social media, I don't bother looking it up. I immediately ask you because you always immediately know the reference. And actually, maybe it's funny that when submitting your the first draft of your dissertation to the printing press at Tartu, they refused to print it because there were so many references that it was simply too costly to print the dissertation. Just to give you an idea of the number of references Nino can pull out of her magic hat, it's really, really a lot of them. Number 3, I think you are, and I mean it in a very, very positive way, I think you are a bit of a statistics nerd, a bit of a statistics geek. You really mastered several statistical methods. You're very good in R, you're very good in M+. I think most people would simply stop there. You don't, because you recently told me that you want to study Python, because of course Python is the future, R is old school, right? So you need to study Python. I think this is also very, very typical for you. Feature 4, I have 5, so it stops at a while, and then I will say something positive about your dissertation also. Number 4 is, I think you're a very modest person. I think you're really an excellent researcher. You already achieved a lot. You have a lot to be proud of, but you're not someone who shouts around about your achievements all the time. You don't seek the spotlight, and while I think this is a very nice feature of you, I think you should also sometimes be careful, of course. Don't let other people outshine you. You have a lot to be proud of, so no problem also sharing that. And finally, and last but not least, I think you're also a very kind person. Because also with everyone I spoke to, when they speak about you, it's always one of the first words which comes up. You are very respectful, very polite. You can take the perspective of other people. And I think because of that, for me, it was also really a pleasure to collaborate with you over all these years. Enough about you, because otherwise I will get emotional as well, and I want to avoid this in public. So let me say something positive about your work. You have a nice mix of different methods, theoretical piece, systematic review, diary study, several cross-sectional studies, and 4 of these 6 chapters already published in international peer-reviewed journals, so that's very nice. Now, you also co-authored several papers, and actually when looking at your publication list, it's very nice. Also, the papers get already quite some citations, which is also nice to see. And of course, you did not only publish, you also presented at conferences. You supervised a large number of master thesis students. You also already shared some of your insights with the press. So, I mean, this is all really, really spectacular. Well, of course, this is sort of the end of a certain period, but also the start of a new one, of course. And Rob and I were very happy that you decided to stay with us at Maastricht as a postdoctoral researcher. Well, Rob and I will really try our best to help you to continue to grow as a researcher, and we really hope that you will enjoy the time with us here in Maastricht. And well, of course, I need to end at some point. So let me end here by congratulating you one last time, And on behalf of the three of us, we are very, very, very proud of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this nice laudatio. And dear Dr. Gugushvili, also on behalf of Maastricht University, that's a difficult word, congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. And I hereby end this academic session.